few months ago, I was reading Kate Crawford's book, Atlas of AI, and I came across a story. It was about a horse, and not just any horse. A horse that could supposedly do mathematics. And the horse's name was Clever Hans. In the early 1900s, Germany became obsessed with him because people believed that Hans could solve arithmetic problems, tell time, identify dates, and even answer questions from the audience. So when someone asked, for instance, what is 2 plus 3, Hans would tap his hoof 5 times. And he was usually right, so he became something of an international celebrity. Scientists studied him, newspapers wrote about him, crowds gathered to watch him perform, so many people really believed they were witnessing something extraordinary. The scientists eventually investigated Hans more carefully, and what they discovered was really interesting. Hans wasn't actually solving mathematical problems. Instead, he was responding to subtle cues from humans around him. As Hans approached the correct answer, the person asking the question would unconsciously change their posture, meaning their facial expression would shift, their breathing would change. And so Hans had actually learned to detect these signals. And when he noticed them, he stopped tapping, meaning the horse wasn't really doing arithmetic, he was reading humans. And what I find so interesting is that nobody was intentionally deceiving anyone, because the humans themselves didn't realize they were giving Hans these clues. So really nobody was cheating, nobody was trying to fake intelligence, and yet everyone became convinced that they were witnessing intelligence. Psychologists later called this the Clever Hans effect, the tendency for our expectations to shape what we observe without us realizing it. And this is really where Crawford's argument becomes so interesting. She uses the story to ask a bigger question. How is intelligence made? At first glance, Hans' intelligence looked like something that belonged to the horse. But Crawford shows that it was actually produced through a whole system. The trainer, the audience, the scientists, the newspaper, the institutions that tested him. So the cultural desire to see human-like intelligence in a non-human system. In other words, Hans's intelligence was not simply discovered, it was made. And that's where the story becomes relevant to AI. Because when we use systems like ChatGPT, it's easy to feel like we're interacting with intelligence. It can answer questions, write essays, generate ideas, explain complex concepts. And sometimes it feels almost magical. Just like the audience is watching Clever Hans, we naturally ask, is this intelligence? But Crawford's point pushes us towards a different question. Not only is AI intelligent, but how do certain behaviors come to be recognized as intelligence in the first place? So that shift really stayed with me, because once you start thinking this way, AI stops being only a technical question. It also becomes a cultural question. A question about meaning, a question about categories, a question about what we value. We often talk about intelligence as though it is obvious, as though it is something we can simply observe, measure, and compare. But the story of Clever Hans suggests otherwise. Suggests that intelligence is never quite that simple. Because thousands of people looked at Hans and saw intelligence. Scientists looked at Hans and saw intelligence. And the question wasn't whether they were observing something real. They were. Hans really was responding. Hans really was performing. He was doing something impressive. The question was how they interpreted what they observed. And perhaps something similar is happening with AI today. AI systems are undeniably impressive, but they are also force us to think more carefully about what intelligence actually means. Is intelligence the ability to produce the right answer? Is it reasoning, understanding, or maybe something like creativity? We can agree on the fact that there's no single definition everyone agrees on. That matters because the way we define intelligence really shapes what we recognize as intelligent. Hans wasn't doing mathematics. He was detecting subtle human signals that most humans themselves didn't notice. And that's an extraordinary ability, but nobody came to see a horse that was remarkably good at reading humans. They came to see a horse that could do mathematics, because that was what counted as intelligence. And I think AI really forces us to confront a similar issue. Not only can machines think, but also what kinds of abilities do we value? What do we reward? What do we measure? What do we ignore? Importantly, who gets to decide? This is why I think many debates about AI really focus on the wrong question. The most common question is, will it become smarter than humans? But the more interesting question might actually be, what is AI teaching us about how humans define intelligence in the first place? So in the end, we can maybe say that the story about Clever Hans wasn't really a story about a horse, it was about human expectations. People wanted to see intelligence, so they saw intelligence. And perhaps one of the most important lessons of AI is that intelligence has never been as straightforward, neutral, or natural as we often imagine. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. On this channel, I explore just in general ideas I find interesting and that shape how we understand the world. Thank you for watching.